Now, Percy Ure's range was vast, from archaic pottery in Boeotia to the age of Justinian. There is no evidence known to me that he took an interest in ancient animals. But he was a man who took seriously both texts and material culture, and this presentation is intended as a small tribute to him. He would be pleased to see the department that he founded so evidently flourishing in its 2nd century. Now, the fauna of our planet are familiar to most of us, at least at second hand, from TV documentaries or YouTube videos, and usually also at first hand from zoos, or even, if we're lucky, from expensive safaris in various degrees of comfort directly related to the price charged by the safari company. But until the development of the commercial zoo in the 19th century, exotic animals were more familiar to the inhabitants of European towns and cities under the Roman Empire than at any subsequent period. New species were objects of intense interest, as fascinating as Annalise's plane tree. The expansion of Roman power across the Mediterranean in the late Republic generated fierce competition in introducing both foreign plants and also foreign animals. In 58 BC, Marcus Aemilius Scaurus showed Rome her first hippopotamus and 5 crocodiles. In 55, Pompey displayed a lynx, a rhinoceros, and a mysterious monkey that may have been the so-called bleeding heart baboon from the highlands of Ethiopia. So this is all in aid of Julius Caesar in 46 BC, who showed the first giraffe, a very seldom represented beast in Roman art. Something of the exoticism of these imports can be inferred from the ancient accounts. Along with his hippo and crocodiles, Scaurus displayed a skeleton, 40 feet long, with a spine 1.5 feet thick, that he claimed to be the skeleton of the mythical sea monster, the Katos, that had threatened Andromeda at Jaffa in Judea. This story shows how thin was the line between fact and fantasy when it came to exotic imports. And Caesar's giraffe, a species very rarely depicted, as I've said, in Roman sources, gave his chroniclers a lot of trouble. Dio, struggling more than 200 years later to describe this thing. I will give an account of the so-called camelopard, because it was then introduced by Caesar into Rome for the first time and exhibited to all. This animal is like a camel in all respects, except that its legs are not all of the same length, the hind legs being the shorter. Beginning from the rump, it gradually grows higher, which gives it the appearance of mounting some elevation. And towering high aloft, it supports the rest of its body on its front legs and lifts its neck in turn to an unusual height. Its skin is spotted like a leopard, and for this reason it bears the joint name of both animals. Such is the appearance of this beast. In both these cases, Scaurus is claimed to have discovered the skeleton of the mythical Katos, and Dio's efforts to describe the appearance of a giraffe. We see something of the slipperiness and instability of this discourse in Roman culture. These animals were the vast, mysterious unknown, the vast, mysterious, threatening unknown. How were the Romans to control them in reality as large, live, powerful beasts with which they came into physical contact, but also in words and pictures? They couldn't film them as we can. They could only translate them into memory, word, and image. This evening I would like to explore with you some of the ways in which animals were represented in the hunt, which is the chief context in which the Romans encountered them and therefore situated them. The repertoire of sources is vast. I have to be ruthlessly selective, but I hope, at least on the visual side, to introduce you to some renderings that have only recently been discovered and may therefore be unfamiliar to you. And I hope that we may be able to draw some conclusions that are valid, at least for the sample that we're going to look at. at the outset, I do not want to give the impression that this is all about exotica. Indeed, Europe had its share of dangerous wild animals, who featured in the Roman consciousness both as a real threat in the countryside and as part of the legacy of Greek literature. So it's with a few literary representations that I want to begin. Tut, tut. Something nasty has happened to the text on this screen. I'm not sure whether we can do anything about it. I think we won't worry about it. You'll be able to follow what I say. This is why I'd hoped to use the computer, my own laptop, but never mind. If we speak nicely to this, I'm sure. Good. So, I want to begin with a few literary representations to see how the animals are represented. I've already mentioned control. Hunting is about man's bravery and skill overcoming brute strength and power. So frequently the animals are depicted two-dimensionally, if at all. One of the most detailed accounts of a hunting scene in the whole of Latin literature is, surprisingly, provided in the prologue to Seneca's tragedy Phaedra. It is spoken in the voice of a hunter, describing the preparations for the hunt and invoking Diana, who's feared by the beasts and whose power will kill them. Each animal has its standard epithet, a little like the way in which certain conventions govern the animal's iconographic representation too. And my example is not a European beast, but it is the elephant, which a Roman elephant inevitably has cross-hatching on its body. And this represents what the elder Pliny calls its cutis cancellata, its latticework skin. And he even tells us that it can contract the creases in its skin to kill little insects that are annoying it. So every elephant always has cross-hatched skin. You can amuse yourselves in the subsequent slides spotting the cross-hatching of all the elephants. But this is a standard trope, and in the same way, literature has its standard epithets for these beasts. And you can see here that lions are gatulos, but I'm accusative here, because they come from that part of the Roman world, and deer come from Crete, and does are always swift, and so on and so forth. So there are these standard tropes: tigers are variegated, bison are shaggy, and all the rest of it. And the animals are simply prey. There's no description in Seneca's 84-line prologue of the animals beyond these standard epithets which trigger a Pavlovian reaction for the Roman audience. There's no interest in them for their own sake. They're straw beasts set up to populate the surroundings with suitable quarry. The passage is not quite composed of cliches, but it does demonstrate that the animals in Roman hunting scenes are sometimes generic entities. The focus in Seneca's prologue is on the goddess to whom they're all subordinate. But looking for Roman attitudes to animals in a drama based on Greek myth can only get us so far. What about the accounts of actual hunting by real people? The younger Pliny more than once mentions going hunting, but only to subvert expectations by emphasizing how much writing he can get done during all the sitting around waiting for the animals to emerge. Once again, the animals are generic quarry, and the spotlight, no surprise here, is on Pliny himself and his carefully cultivated intellectual persona. Pliny's quarry are boar. This animal is the stuff of some evocative similes in the Iliad. In Book 11, for instance, the Trojans press round Odysseus like hounds and youths crowding round a boar as it whets its tusks. And in Book 14, Idomeneus waits for Aeneas like a boar standing his ground. Virgil, as Homer's heir, likewise employs boar similes. But Virgil never writes to a formula. Every line of his poetry is profound, as with the artistry with which he evokes the boar, to which he likens the violent and terrifying Italic king Mezentius in Aeneid Tale. The simile is transported to an Italian setting with Virgil's topographical epithets, and with the empathy that suffuses the Aeneid, he uses the rhythms of the dactylic hexameter to mirror the instincts and behavior of the beast. Now, fingers crossed, everybody, that we might see the screen. Wonderful. I will first read the translation by Robert Fitzgerald, and then I'll try to demonstrate how much meaning resides in the metrical effects of the original Latin. Think of a wild boar, one Mount Vesulus kept safe in his pine forests many years before the nipping hounds harried him out, or one the Laurentine marsh for long has fed on weedy undergrowth. Now ringed by hunters, ready with nets, he stands at bay and snorts, ferocious with his bristling hump, and no one's blood is up enough to go in closer. They keep safely away as they attack with darts and shouts, while he turns on them all, undaunted, waiting for the time to charge, gnashing his tusks and shrugging off the darts. So men who justly hated Mezentius had not the gall to meet him, blade to blade, but harried him with darts and wild shouts at a safe distance. Now I've colour-coded the Latin to exaggerate the metrical effects so that you can hear the animal being driven from his cover in the enjambment of the first two lines in blue. Aquelut ille canum morsu de montibus altis actus aper. Getting stuck in the net in the elisions at line 710 in green, post winter retia ventumst, screeching to a halt at the beginning of line 711, where length of word and metrical foot exactly coincide in orange with substitute, puts the brakes on, and struggling to rip the spears from his back in a series of powerful spondaic jerks at line 718, resolved by the successful rush of the penultimate dactyl. And that part is in black. Dentibus infrendens et tergo decutit astas. In between, the elisions at line 712 capture the stammering anxiety of the hunters. In green again, nec quirasci propriusva cedere virtus. I realize that not everybody in the audience is necessarily a classicist, so I've also color-coded the translation to show you where we are in the story. And this has the added advantage of showing how much the English misses by being unable to reflect Virgil's mastery of the meter. And I'll try to read it. I'm sure people here who can read Latin poetry much more successfully than I can. The temptation is always to exaggerate the meter, but I'll try, and I will exaggerate it a little bit, so that you can hear the animal moving. If you can follow the Latin, even if you don't understand Latin, you'll be able to see from the colour where the effects are, and I'll do my best. Ac velut ille canum morsu de montibus altis actus aper, multos vesulusque pinifer annos defendit, multosque palus Larentia silva, pascit uram denea, posquinter retia ventumst, substitit, infremuitque ferox, et inormit armos, neque quirasci proprius vacere virtus, sed iaculis tutisque procur clamoribus instant. Il audim pavidus partiscum tatur in omnis, dentibus infrendens et tergo decutit estas. Haudaliter, justae quibus est Mezentius irae, non uliest animus stricto concurrere ferro, missilibus longet vasto tremore lacessunt. The epic inheritance of this ferocious animal as the anti-hero is likewise exploited by Ovid with metrical virtuosity, this time in one of his most sophisticated parodies, the burlesque account of the slaying of the Caledonian bull. The panoply of Greek heroes who go after it make a fearful mess of the hunt. Nestor even has to climb a tree to get out of its way, which points up the irony that in the end it is Atalanta, a mere woman, who strikes the fatal blow. I've sacrificed a literal rendering in favour of the translation by Arthur Golding from the time of Shakespeare, for the quintessentially Ovidian quality of its jaunty charm. But yet the moody beast thereby was set the more on fire, and chafing like the lightning swift, he uttereth forth his ire. A fire did sparkle from his eyes, and from his boiling breast he breathed flaming flakes of fire, conceived in his chest. And look with what a violent brunt a mighty bullet goes, from engine bent against a wall, to bulwarks full of foes. With even such violence rushed the swine among the hunts amain, and overthrew Eupelemon and Pelagon both twain, that in the right place were. Their fellows stepping to, and drawing them away, did save their lives with much ado. The monosyllabic line ending at 359, which is in blue, we remember Horace's ridiculus mus, ridiculous mouse, is combined with a grand polysyllabic compound adjective to create the deliberately incongruous identification of the boar as a vulnificus sus, literally a wound-inflicting pig. And the meter gathers momentum in the line via the sequence dactyl, so dum diddy, spondy, dum dum, spondy, dum dum, dactyl, dum diddy, spondy, dum dum, tumbling via enjambment onto the next line to mirror the boar starting out, gathering speed, and then flinging himself at his hapless victims. In juvenes certusig impete vulnificus tus fertur. Goes over the line, goes for his prey. The Latin charges just like the boar. And then the enjambment into the next line too, followed by a strong caesura in the last line of the extract, deflates the episode with the hasty rescue job as their fellow hunters ignominiously wear the corpses of Eupalemon and Pelagon away. Vertur et amor Pelagonaque dextra tuentes corva prosternit. The point is not that Virgil and Ovid had attended a boar hunt and taken notes. It is that their poetic imagination was fired by an animal with the power and status to evoke a sophisticated artistic response. While I've been talking about boars, you've seen some artistic representations of this beast, mostly from mosaics. Just as Virgil and Ovid are working within the parameters of epic poetry and the constraints of the dactylic hexameter, so too do the artists of mosaic pavements work with set pieces, constrained by the architectural space that they're decorating. These compositions are so vivid that it is a tremendous temptation to read them as historical documents, faithful representations of reality. They are, of course, historical documents of a sort, in that individual details within them can be shown to correspond to realia of contemporary life. For instance, the sliding door, which you can see here, of the cage into which this bear is being tempted by the delicious ham. And the door, you see the ham there? This has an exact analogue, this sliding door. It's going to slide down there. An exact analogue at Carnuntum on the Danube, where the slots of the animal cages outside the amphitheatre. You see, there's the amphitheatre, then there's this little sort of antechamber with these openings all the way around, and I've taken this photo from the other side, so we're looking through this sort of enclosure, and you can very clearly see, particularly down here and there, the slots for exactly those sliding doors. So sometimes the mosaics do in fact represent reality. And these slots must have supported exactly those kinds of doors that could be slid up and down. But the hunt mosaics that are such popular domestic decoration in the 3rd and 4th centuries are not photographs. And this makes them particularly valuable as illustrations of how the Romans conceived of the animals that they were hunting, and indeed how they conceived of the artistry of hunting itself. The corridor of the so-called Great Hunt in the villa at Piazza Armerina, in the center of Sicily, is a vivid illustration, known I'm sure to many of you, of precisely the combination of realism and fantasy that we've already seen exemplified in Scaurus's boast to have found the skeleton of the Katos. And amid all the recognizable species with which the mosaic teems, we find a phoenix rising from the ashes, and a griffin astride a cage. These epitomize perhaps the fabulous East, but they're seamlessly juxtaposed with the narrative elements of the mosaic, as though there were no disjunction between the animals that the Romans could cart home, dead or alive, and those that they could never find, because they don't exist. Many of you may have seen this remarkable artifact, which is late Roman, dating from the first quarter of the 4th century AD. The Hunt mosaic, the Great Hunt mosaic, lies here in room 28, this long transverse corridor. There's the north arrow, so north end, south end. and it's behind the peristyle courtyard. They've put this netting over it. I was there in May and had to photograph it through this netting. But the corridor is behind the veranda on this east side of the peristyle courtyard. So the long corridor is up there. And we're going to spend a little time with that now. First, I'm going to show you a very faint drawing. You'll scarcely be able to see it, but the reason it's there is to demonstrate how busy and detailed the space is. You can probably see the two ships in the center. It's too long to put on one screen, so there's one ship and there's the companion ship. They're both in the middle of the long corridor. You have to wrap it around over here behind me. And you can see ostriches going up the gangplank on this side, and on the other side you can see an elephant mounting the gangplank on the right. So anchor yourselves with those two ships. And I'm going to now show you two views of the corridor itself. This is the view looking north, where we're looking past the elephant, climbing up the gangplank. And then the south view, you will see the ostriches. Well, you just see the wingtip of the ostrich climbing up the gangplank onto this ship, and then there's the other ship in the distance with the heffalump distance. Okay, so it's immediately striking that the mosaic is essentially composed in two registers. Above, savage cats are mauling antelope. In fact, they're mauling man and beast alike, because here's a man being mauled, and then we get the beast being mauled, and you'll see more of them over here. That's the same one. Here's another one. While below, down here, the hunters in teams are absorbed in the task of transporting species of all sorts by land and, as we've just seen, by sea. Essentially African species, though in addition to the phoenix and the griffin, there are other interlopers, namely, here's the transport continuing. We have a tiger, which of course is not an African animal, tigress in this case, and we have the one-horned rhino. If this is an accurate representation, that would be an Asian species, but as I've already said, we're not dealing with a photograph. And then we have this wonderfully shaggy European bison with his great tufts on his elbows. Mainly African animals, but not exclusively. Now, since these animals are being captured alive, they must be intended for display in the amphitheaters of the empire. Indeed, it seems possible that arena displays have influenced the images that we see on this floor, since in these displays, beasts were set upon each other as well as being hunted by professional marksmen. And so when you see an image like the leopard going for this, I think that's probably meant to be maybe a kudu, or it may be meant to be an impala, it's hard to tell. But you are sometimes on arena mosaics even see animals being bound together to ensure confrontation, as in this contest between a bull armed with horn and hoof and the bear with tooth and claw. This is the Sleeping mosaic in Libya. But it's noteworthy that the species on the Great Hunt mosaic that are pouncing on other species are natural predators, cats attacking antelope. So I think we're actually dealing here with what springs from factual observation of the law of the jungle. I don't think the inspiration for this is actually arena displays, because it's always a cat going after an antelope, which is, of course, the inevitable fate of these teeming antelope on the plains of Africa. Now, the absence of Roman sentimentality about the natural world stems from their unmediated contact with it. Ours is the first age when, thanks to television, we can afford to be idealistic about the animal kingdom. The bleeding of the prey, bleeding of the prey on the Great Hunt mosaic is depicted in heartless detail. But the animals are of a lower order, and their suffering is the lot of their station. Similar, in fact, to the graphic bleeding, I apologize for the horror of this, of a prisoner condemned ad bestias, as on this, to us, horrifying mosaic from El Jem in Tunisia. Indeed, wild animals not only belonged to a lower order, they were also a pest, a threat to human well-being. We're gradually being trained in ecological sensitivity, but Romans had no such scruples. Rather, they saw the wilderness as a space to be tamed and its natural inhabitants as a danger to be eliminated. And an epigram from the Greek anthology expresses this attitude perfectly. You furthest Macedonian wilds of Libya, no longer your expanse vexed by the hordes of wild beasts of the continent shall you ring in echo, even beyond the sounds of the nomads, to the voice of lions roaring in the desert. Since Caesar Jr. has trapped the countless tribe and brought it face to face with his fighters, now the heights that were once full of the lairs of prowling beasts are pasturage for cattle and men. In other words, trapping animals for the arena has the tremendous benefit of making the wilderness safe for farmers to graze their herds. And in the 6th century, the epigrammatist Luxurius says something similar. Our sense of the planet as a fragile ecological system and constant threat from human interference is utterly absent from the ancient world. Since Piazza Marina was excavated in the 20th century, we can be moderately confident that it was not restored wholesale by ambitious and imaginative, inverted commas, conservators. And so what we see is probably what the ancient owners of this villa saw when the mosaicists fulfilled their commission. Mosaic is a relatively crude medium. You can't get the subtlety of brush strokes that you can get in painting. But it's perfectly suited to render the hide and musculature of a wild animal, as in the remarkable moulding and shading of this leopard. His snout and his lolling tongue picked out with menacing red tesserines, tiny little tubes of stone. We do know that ancient artists drew from life, at least based on an anecdote in the natural history of the older Pliny, who tells how the sculptor Basitides was so busy chiseling a lion down at the docks in Rome that he was almost mauled by a panther, Pliny may mean a leopard or cheetah, we're not sure, that escaped from a neighboring cage. Clearly, the narrative of the Great Hunt mosaic conveys the preoccupation with control over the animal kingdom that I mentioned earlier, and the animals are also an index of the diligence and effort to which their handlers will go to supply them where they're needed, however fancifully it's rendered. Anybody who clasps an ostrich around the waist, like this, would be kicked to death right away. But the motif conveys domination by man and the order that he introduces into the animal kingdom. As I've already said, the aim is not literal veracity. Still, the danger posed by these beasts is part of their fascination, and the fate of this tunic-clad attendant on the Hunt mosaic from Annaba in Algeria offsets the narrative of bravery and cunning exemplified in the other details. The mounted hunters, the bait corralled in clearings behind the central trap, the trap itself carefully constructed of netting hidden by shrubs, in front of which shields are arranged in front of the shrubs. And there are flares poking out from behind the shields, presumably brandished by attendants, although we can't see them. The cage, standing open on the right, there's that door again, which will run vertically up and down in the slots on either side. The cage, standing open on the right, is mounted on a wheeled chassis. The destination of the animal that will be chased inside it is clear. Images of the actual beast shows are less common in the gladiatorial scenes, but the well-known Megarius mosaic, which you can see on the screen, bears eloquent testimony to the Roman interest in witnessing animal suffering. And I put that as carefully as I could, the Roman interest in witnessing animal suffering. 4 named leopards, Victor, Crispinus, Luxurius, and Romanus, are bleeding profusely at the hands of 4 named hunters. And an attendant in the middle is displaying 4 money bags, which together with the tray that they're on, this nice oval tray of handles, constitute the reward to the company of the Telegenii. You can see their name there. Telegenii, who supplied the beasts. They're well known from inscriptions. This inscription in the center of this mosaic documents the statement voiced by a herald concerning the value of the show. And as you can see, he suggests 500 denarii, denarius quingentos, per leopard, pro leopardo. And then the inscription goes on to record acclamations by the spectators who had had a wonderful time at Megarius's show. There's his name in the vocative case. It's the only word you can read from both sides of this floor, by the way. Since the money bags each bear the symbol not for 500 but for 1,000, it looks like our infinity sign, Megarius clearly demonstrated his pleasure at the crowd's response by doubling the Telegeni's fee. It's always seemed to me particularly upsetting that the leopards have names, which seems to personalize their suffering in the most callous manner. Look at the bleeding. There's puddles everywhere. But that distress, on my part, is a modern response, modern perspective, distorted by pathos. Possibly the Roman spectators could inspect the cages beforehand to lay bets on the outcome of each engagement. Then they would need to be able to distinguish one leopard from another. And like the prisoner on the Algem mosaic, it's the lot in life of these beasts to bleed. They're being useful by doing so, supplying entertainment for the people, and giving them the satisfaction of seeing man overcome beast and rid the wilderness of their rampaging. Whether the spectators saw beauty in these creatures is hard to gauge, but they certainly saw utility, both their ephemeral entertainment value and the longer-term use to be made of their body parts. And mosaicists of Carthage could riff wittily on the theme of the tiger skin rug. When the younger Pliny went hunting equipped with his writing tablets, and to his astonishment bagged 3 boars in the process, he was not catching animals for the arena, he was indulging in an aristocratic pastime. Scenes of pastoral life on mosaics from North Africa sometimes include hunting, as on the Dominus Iulius mosaic from Carthage, now in the Bardo Museum in Tunis. At other times, the hunt is the exclusive focus, also set out as a series of cameos occupying distinct registers, as in the small hunt mosaic, again from Piazza Arena, with a sacrifice at the top and a picnic in the middle, eating a huge chicken. Especially prominent here is the role of the hounds, which, modeling cooperation with humans, contrast markedly with their savage beasts of prey. This is the standard symbiosis that Ovid subverts in telling the story of Actaeon, who saw Diana in her bath and was punished for it by being changed into a stag and torn apart by his own hounds, lovingly catalogued by name by Ovid. The fine sculpture you can see on the screen of a stag mauled by hounds from the eponymous House of the Stag in Herculaneum may be a representation of this story. If we're looking for empathy, we have a chance of finding it in the treatment of hounds. One thinks at once of Lydia, the hunting hound, who is the subject of a funerary epigram in Martial. This is a literary exercise predicated on the actual habit of commemorating household pets with inscribed epitaphs. We have several surviving examples, often composed in touchingly inept meter. But it also reflects a reality of ancient hunting, namely the indispensable cooperation between hounds and hunter. nurtured among the trainers of the amphitheatre, bred up for the chase, fierce in the forest, gentle in the house. I was called Lydia, a most faithful attendant upon my master Dexter, who would not have preferred to me a pound of Illyrian, or the dog which followed Catullus from the land of Crete, and was translated with him to the stars of the light-bringing goddess. I died, not of length of years, nor of useless old age, as was the fate of the hound of Ulysses. I was killed by the fiery tooth of a foaming boar, as huge as that of Calidon, or that of Alananthus. Nor do I complain, though thus prematurely hurried to the shades below. I could not have died a nobler death. The reality of hound-man cooperation lies behind the paradox that Ovid exploits in his description of Actaeon turned stag, set upon by his own hounds, tossing his head, uttering a distressed cry, and sinking to his knees. And I must warn you that the tears are Arthur Golding's addition to fill out Elita. No part of him was free from wound. He could none other do but sigh, and in the shape of harp, with voice as hearts are wont, the voice of man was none left now to help him at the brunt, by braying showed his secret grief among the mountains high, and kneeling sadly on his knees, with dreary tears in eye, as one by humbling of himself that mercy seemed to crave, with piteous look, instead of hands, his head about to wave. Not knowing that it was their lord, the huntsmen cheer their hounds with wonted noise, and for Actaeon look about the grounds. They halloo, who could loudest cry, still calling him by name, as though he were not there, and much his absence they do blame, in that he came not to the fore, but slacked to see the game. The human instinct to anthropomorphize animals needs no explanation in our pet-keeping age, but it is notable that pity for animal suffering is rarely expressed by ancient authors, except when the beasts behave in a strikingly human way, or they are actually a person, just disguised as a beast, as you have just seen in Ovid's passage. The classic example of the empathy for a human-like mode of behavior from a wild animal is the display of elephants at the opening of Pompey's theatre, which misfired from Pompey's point of view when the elephants roused the spectators' sympathies by seeming to have something of the human about them. Esse quondam illi belluae cum genere humano societates. The feeling that the monsters shared something in common with the human race. One category of evidence that I have, I confess, only looked at rather superficially so far, are the hunting manuals in both prose and verse, including the reworking of Xenophon's Cynegetica by Arrian in the 2nd century AD to include the use of sight hounds, so hounds that don't just hunt with their noses but with their eyes as well. These treatises are very revealing of attitudes towards the hounds, with which their owners could clearly build a very close relationship. What they say about the different kinds of quarry tends obviously to be very practical and unemotional. But what is very striking is the intimate knowledge of the behavior of these various species and the very close observation of their habits and movements. This has some relevance when we look at examples of the hare chase that is a staple on hunting mosaics from the 4th century and beyond. The crouching hare on the small hunt mosaic at Piazza Armerina, which was on your poster, is about to be skewered by a hunter wielding a two-toothed spear, a bident as opposed to a trident. And as in the great hunt, the quarry's snout and mouth are picked out in red, and also the lower eyelid, giving the animal a look of bloodshot terror. Usually, the hare is crouching in her form. The ancient artists got this detail right, but without the menacing bident aimed at her, as on 2 Tunisian mosaics, this one from El Jem, and then there's another one which is from Libya, and there you see the hare crouching in her form with the millet stalks on either side. And also from the hunt mosaic, small hunt mosaic, we see a graphic illustration of the hounds pursuing the hare, and the inevitable outcome, the hunter posing in pride, frontally facing us with his quarry. Now, I would like to briefly consolidate the themes that we've identified so far by considering two hunt mosaics that have recently come on display. The first is comparable to the Piazza Marina small hunt, and it comes from the villa beside the river Telaro in southeast Sicily, from which I've taken my title slide. An exquisite example of how well-suited mosaic is to capture the salient features of a strongly marked animal like a lion. The whisker beds, each rendered by a single dark tessera, and the mane combed into brown and red and blue-grey tones. The mosaic is very crowded, similar in composition to the small hunt mosaic, but busier and executed in a different style and color range, the palette dominated by red and yellow. The bottom register shows the kill hanging up in a tree, an eviscerated antelope with its back boobs, hounds jumping up onto bite. And then above that, we have a tigress downing a hunter. I'll show it to you a bit better here. There you have the tigress downing a hunter, and his horse is fleeing in terror with its saddle on its back, fleeing the scene. This is the theme of nature worsting man. And then above them, a hunter shoots into a tree with a bow and arrow. Next to that scene in the middle of the mosaic, a lion eviscerates an antelope, beast on beast violence. Okay? Guts spilling out. And then below this is the centerpiece, unfortunately damaged. So this is what I'm going to show you now. I know, it looks as though he's carrying a surfboard. But we don't know what this is. And it's a real shame that we're missing all this part. But below that, we have the celebratory picnic, very similar to the one at Piazza Arena. Again, a chicken with lots of bread rolls around the limiter. And wine being poured from the jar. And then to the right, you can see the horses being tethered. And above them, at the scene of a cart laden with armor, fording a stream. The prick-eared hound with his tongue hanging out, who's trotting through the water in the foreground, has curly fur masterfully treated by the mosaicist. A composition like this one constructs a narrative, a visual accompaniment to the hunting manuals of late antiquity, like the Cunegetica of Nemesianus, which unfortunately breaks off before the hunt itself is described. The second recent find is very different in composition and theme. It's a mosaic discovered at Lod on the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It's composed of three distinct registers, okay, top, middle, and bottom. I'll not discuss the marine scene down here, except to make a single point about it later. I want to start at the top with the geometric panel. This consists of 9 hexagons with a 10th split in half. So here's the 10th hexagon, wrapping around these 4 on the bottom register. 6 of these 10 hexagons contain traditional xenia, so still life motifs like the basket of fish here, for instance. But the other 4 contain scenes of 3 felines attacking antelope. That's this one, this one, and that one. And then we have the snake throttling a fish. I'll show you some close-ups there. So antelope being preyed upon by felines, very smart. See all the blood pouring from the poor buck, and then this extraordinary snake throttling that gasping fish. I mean, I know fish gasp, that's what fish do, but this one is must be for a special reason. Now, in the central panel, two of the squares at the four compass points show similarly violent encounters, not that one, this one here, this one and that one, violent encounters between cat and antelope or cat and deer. While the one at the bottom, down here, shows you the Dionysiac motif of the two panthers clinging to the sides of an enormous wine jar. And to its left, there is a rabbit eating a bunch of grapes with a hound prancing in the foreground. In the central octagon, this is the most interesting part of this mosaic, 8 species, including a fabulous Katos, sea monster, confront each other without any apparent antagonism. A lion and lioness face each other on rocky outcrops at the top, with a Katos swimming between them. Below them, a giraffe, as I've already said, very rarely depicted, and then this nicely cross-hatched elephant, and a rhino, an African one, because it's got 2 horns, if we can trust the image. And they're facing, the giraffe and the rhino facing the elephant, but not in an antagonistic kind of way. Underneath, a tiger lies behind a bison of some sort. Now, to my knowledge, this motif is without parallel. It's certainly not a hunt, and it contrasts sharply with the violent cameos in the surrounding frame and in that this rectangular panel at the top. What this scene is most closely reminiscent of is images of Orpheus enchanting the animals, except that Orpheus is missing. Orpheus is, I think, the counterpoint to the hunting images. In the hunt, the animals are threatening to all weaker species, including man. Bewitched by Orpheus's spell, however, they're under control, metamorphosed from danger to docility. Images of Orpheus supply a visual catalogue of the natural world, a Noah's Ark of the animal kingdom, except that the animals appear one by one instead of 2 by 2. Predictably, Ovid reinforces the prototype by subverting it. His presentation of Orpheus is accompanied not by the animals, but by a catalogue of 25 different types of tree bending to Orpheus's charm. When I use the term visual catalogue, I'm thinking of the discrete arrangement of the animals, as in this example from Perugia, each animal isolated from his fellow creatures, as though in the plates of a zoological treatise. And there's no repetition, they're all different animals. Indeed, the depiction of these animals may ultimately derive from precisely that source, a zoological treatise, as the famous Nile mosaic from Palestrina may have done, where, I'm going to take you here to this animal, where we have labels in Greek underneath the animals. Most of the creatures are supporting the Greek label under them. In images of Orpheus, the isolated rendering of the animals facing him in regimented ranks, they're all looking towards Orpheus, is well attested elsewhere also, as on this mosaic on the Aventine, where the upper rows start to be anchored on horizontal ground strips. Not the bottom ones, but these are gaining perspective by being anchored on their little ground strips. It's an attempt to define perspective here. And the ground strips become a standard technique, as you can see on this mosaic, which is from Volubilis in Morocco, or here, beautiful Orpheus mosaic from Palermo, where every creature has its little ground strip called shadow, including a little tortoise going up the side. And indeed, well, there's this one from Tunisia, and Acephalus Orpheus, and then there is an Orpheus mosaic. I mean, not very well known because it's so lacunose, unfortunately. This is a drawing of the whole thing. But you can see, once again, we've got these discrete animals. They don't actually ever overlap, but they each have their little ground strip anchoring them, giving you a few little pieces here and there that are good enough to photograph. A nice zebra, very rare, hardly ever see them in mirror images. And then on this side, a very unrealistic looking hippopotamus. Now, here we come closest to a narrative composition with overlapping figures. And that does develop, and it's attested here, for instance, on this mosaic from Libya, from the House of Orpheus, where we have the same docility, and they're all looking towards Orpheus, but they overlap. We've got much more sense here of no longer a catalogue, but actually a composition, and the same with the one I started with, this beautiful piece from Tarsus in Turkey, where all the animals are not only overlapping in perspective, but they're all lying down, except for the elephant at the bottom. You may be able to see his ear and his leg there. Unfortunately, most of him is missing, so we can't be quite sure. But they're all lying in submissive rapture. They're either obscured by one another or hiding behind rocks, but they're all forming a composition. So we've left behind, finally, I think, the visual catalogue idea and a narrative sense to this. Now, the Lord mosaic, with its violent predator-victim pairs juxtaposed with the central peaceable octagon here, seems to combine the atmosphere of the hunting scenes and Orpheus, but with all human presence elided. Even the boats at the bottom, afloat in a fishy sea, show no trace of a human figure. Given the fine spot near Tel Aviv, I have wondered fleetingly whether this is because of an equivocation in Judaism about representing the human figure. But I know too little about this to be able to argue the point, and maybe we could turn to it afterwards in the discussion. I'd like to draw to a close with two final examples that I think illustrate with particular clarity the gulf between our perception of wild animals and the way the Romans perceived them. Throughout Roman art, chubby erotes, or sometimes simply wingless children, are whimsically depicted pursuing adult activities, some of them violent, such as this frieze from the House of the Vetii at Pompeii, where this stag race ends badly for one of the charioteers. Or, without the violent element, the bird charioteers from Piazza Armerina. Every pair is an appropriately colored species of bird. We have the four colors of the circus here: red, white, green, blue. This whimsical treatment extends also to hunting, again incorporating graphic bloodshed, as in these two scenes from the House of the Horses at Carthage. This is a piece of rope that I didn't have the nerve to try and remove. It's there. And here, this upside-down animal absolutely spurting blood like a burst pipe. The effect to us may seem distastefully incongruous, but hunting was an acknowledged activity, and the dispatching of the animal by killing or capture was its acknowledged aim. So in Roman terms, these features qualify for whimsical treatment, just like Cupid gladiators or anything else. My final example is the entrance to the eponymous House of the Bear in Pompeii. It's a nice old-fashioned photograph of it, where the visitor is confronted by this. It's not a Kave Carmen mosaic, which you'd expect to find in the entrance, but the sight of a bear, smudged with red, apparently trying to extract a long reed-like object from its side. While above we have the cheerful greeting, spelled with the aspirate of the local pronunciation, Awe, greetings, hi. The mosaic has suffered a lot of water damage lately, which is why I've juxtaposed the image with this 19th century lithograph. The purpose of showing it to you is in part to urge caution in interpreting ancient evidence for the representation of animals. At first sight, the red patch looks shockingly like blood, but it might be just that, a patch, an ancient repair. Repairs often show cavalier disregard for the the palette and contours of the original. and the bear might be wearing a harness rather than trying to extract a weapon or an instrument of torture from its side. But at least we can be confident that it is a bear and that its presence in the entryway is connected with a warm greeting to guests. The bear is clearly under human control, which is precisely where dangerous animals in Roman times ought to be. So, finally, back to my title, Suffering Beauty, the representation of animals in the Roman hunt. To encapsulate it, I want to leave you with an image of the boar, who is one of the key protagonists of this presentation, dignified with treatment by Virgil, that comes as close as any to showing empathy for a wild animal, and a player in Ovid's mockery of heroic ineptitude, hunting. This image, from the lower right-hand corner of the small hunt mosaic at Piazza Armerina, shows a virile boar putting up a ferocious fight, streaming blood though he is. The mosaic artist has carefully arranged the background so that a double row of pale tesserae set off his magnificent bristles from the rocky landscape behind him. The scene epitomizes the danger that the boar represents. His human victim is bleeding copiously too. But we know that the cooperation of hound and hunter will win. The scene shows beauty and it shows suffering. But it seems that they register differently on the Roman scale of values. The beauty demonstrates the mosaicist's skill, and the suffering shows that nature must submit to man. Our modern perspective is both figuratively and literally distorted. We don't even know whether the people who walked on this floor actually noticed the boar under their feet, far less identified with his bravery, doomed as he was. Beauty and suffering are in the eye of the beholder. Thank you.